Hello and welcome to a lock-in at the Crate and Crowbar. This week we strike from the shadows to mete out a legally questionable form of cinematic justice to Matt Reeves' recent Batman film, called, cleverly, The Batman. I'm Marsh Davis, and answering my signal tonight are two spandex-clad maniacs known to the newspapers as 7 out of 10 Leica Boy, aka Tom Sr.,
Hello.
and the Lanarkshire Loomer, aka Graham Smith.
Hello. Well remembered that I'm from Lanarkshire. That's some good Graham lore.
It's true. I hope you don't mind me blowing your secret identities, but it seems important for the task at hand. Welcome to the morally grey world of grittily rebooted comic book vigilanteism, guys. Are you comic book fans in general? What is your sort of level of engagement with the multimedia intellectual property known as The Batman?
I would say that I was a comic book fan in my early 20s. I went through a phase. I feel like this was quite common. It was an era when lots of people were talking about graphic novels. They were starting to get some cultural cachet beyond just the superhero stuff. And so I started reading graphic novels, and then I went back and started reading some comic book stuff as well. And so I've read some of the more famous superhero comics, and I've read a bunch of some of the more prestigious stuff, and now I've barely read anything except for occasional manga. In terms of Batman, I've seen most of the films and quite a bit of the cartoon and quite a bit of the Adam West. I would say, like, I'm pretty familiar with Batman.
Tom, are you a Bat fan? How do you fit into this, and how do you rate the various film incarnations?
Yeah, so I've seen all the films. I've enjoyed Batman as a character since I was young. I think during, as Graham says, like during the sort of graphic novel repackaging of like comic books as serious literary fiction, sort of. I read the sort of Frank Miller ones, and I've read a bunch of the runs because you could get a bunch of them via like even like Amazon subscriptions and stuff. A lot of them are there. I like comic books. I get Marvel comic books delivered semi-regularly on a subscription from the US, mostly like Spider-Man stuff, because I'm kind of interested in how people choose to modernize these superheroes and the supervillains and the new sort of heroes and villains they choose to create, and what sort of cultural archetypes they're trying to tap into to make Spider-Man or Batman relevant today. And I think the Batman is doing a fair share of that as well.
How do you guys feel about the previous films? I mean, the 90s run versus the Snyder-y run versus the Nolan-y run thus far.
So I liked the I really liked the first film.
Tim Burton's
first films.
Michael Keaton as
Michael
Batman.
Keaton as Batman, and there's actually kind of a sense of humor to it, but it wasn't as slapstick as the Batman and Robin and the stuff that came later. The Snyder stuff I found just utterly tedious, and the Nolan stuff was indulgent, but it still had exciting kind of action scenes, and Batman was an exciting kind of characters to watch when he was allowed to be Batman and not quite a dull Bruce Wayne figure.
Graham, do you feel similarly?
I haven't seen any of the Snyder stuff, actually. That's like, I haven't seen any of the recent DC Cinematic Universe films. That's where I fall out. But I'm a big...
I don't think you've missed anything.
Yeah, well, that's what I hear. I'm a big fan of the Burton films, though, and the Nolan films. I think now, removed from them both, I think I probably prefer the Burton films. Like, I went back to Batman and Batman Returns quite recently, and to Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises, and I think the Burton films hold up much better. There's something about Nolan's attempt to make Batman legitimate, which renders those films, I think, slightly more boring to rewatch, essentially. And I think The Dark Knight is still a great film, certainly, but the two on either side of it aren't, I don't think.
There's a kind of glossy self-seriousness to those films now, which, looking back on it, feels more ludicrous and desperate, I think. Whereas the Tim Burton films, which have their faults, he knew what kind of film he was making. He didn't try and have pretensions towards high art in it, I don't think, in the same way that Nolan probably imagines his Batman films to be.
I enjoyed the kind of hyper realism of those films. Like, you know, Gotham was really like crazy, like full of gargoyles, and you got Danny Elfman's fantastic soundtrack as well. It was very kind of like showy and pompous in a way that I really enjoyed, and it sort of accepted that Batman is fundamentally, from the suit forwards, like slightly ludicrous character, and you know, just set the tone accordingly.
The one I like best, I think it's Batman Returns, which has Catwoman in it,
Yeah.
played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and Penguin, played by Danny DeVito. And it's great fun throughout, and it kind of understands that the villains don't need to just be horrible, evil villains. Like Penguin in that is like an Edward Scissorhands style character, where you sort of root for him. There's something forlorn and sad and funny about his almost silent attempts to become mayor of Gotham and getting swept up in this campaign by people around him. Like it's satire, and it's funny, and it's kind of joyous and theatrical. Marsh, you've asked these questions. You didn't mention Joel Schumacher's Batman, which is distinct from Burton's quite substantially in those later films. And they're obviously trash, but I went to the cinema. That was the kind of era, because the Burton's film, the first one was like 89 when I was 4 years old. So the first Batman films I went to see at the cinema were like Batman and Robin and Mr. Freeze, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, spouting puns.
I mean, I feel like they are, even though they aren't obviously by Tim Burton, I feel like they're part of the same run. I feel like the continuity was maintained. Like, it wasn't meant to be a reboot of Batman between those Batman films. It was meant to be a continuation of the same story that began in the first one.
I really enjoyed Batman Forever from that run. So you've got Jim Carrey as the Riddler in that, which is you know, the polar opposite of the Riddler in the Batman in this film. And I think Two-Face was in it as well, and it was just really kind of super colourful as a film. Lots of kind of really like silly, almost pantomime performances from the villains in particular. And to me, like, a lot of what makes Batman really fun is the villains, like, because they're so silly and weird. And some of them, a lot of them are a bit rubbish. But you know, that contrasting with the seriousness of Batman as a figure is part of the fun for me.
That film couldn't be less like the one
right.
we're about to discuss. I mean, given that, how did you go, and what were your expectations going into this film? I assume you knew that it was, you know, quote unquote gritty, and it obviously follows on the heels of the what I think was an awful film, Joker, a couple of years ago. I mean, so yeah, well, what was your take on it going into it?
I expected it to attempt to be like a study of how to try to fix or do your small part in a moral cesspit from which there is ultimately no escape. So Gotham and like New York City in the 80s and that kind of stuff, a lot of the imagery pulls from that. And it's this idea that, you know, crime is rife, everyone is corrupt, no one is capable of good. But can you change that? Is there anything you can do to change that? And that is kind of like going into that, and that is what it's about, I think. I think it doesn't really say much about that. It just reveals everyone to be, you know, a bit wrong, Batman included, Bruce Wayne included.
Interesting. I think we may. Oh yeah, I might disagree with that, but we'll probably get to that as we discuss. Graham,
I'd seen the trailer going into it, and I liked that trailer. You know, it uses the recurring score that happens throughout the film, which I won't replicate. If you've seen the film, you'll know it. And it was very moody, and I had some interesting like shots and cinematography, and so like I was cautiously optimistic based on the trailer. After not, you know, hearing that the Snyder films were terrible and thinking the trailers looked so bad that I didn't even bother to see them. But what about you, Marsh? What did you think of it?
I had some trepidation because I didn't jibe with. I mean, I haven't. Obviously, Snyder's grimdark stuff is absolutely dreck dumb idiocy. And I thought the recent Joker was very misguided in both its kind of moral outlook, but also its sort of very brazen aspirations to be a better form of cinema than it actually was. I I found it quite foul. I would say so. And actually, the kind of anxieties that you had about this world being corrupt beyond any chance of redemption, I think that's always a danger for the Batman in general, and vigilante stories. Frank Miller's run on this is particularly noxious, I think, because it creates an excuse for just total nihilism and selfishness, because the world is beyond saving after a certain point. So those were my fears that it would play to that. I think it references that, but I actually think it gives a much more, ultimately, a more sort of hopeful view of things. Is that how you felt coming out of the film overall?
I felt very tired coming out of the film. That was my foremost feeling. But I did sort of. I did like the Batman. I do like Robert Pattinson as Batman.
Yeah.
I think he's very, very good in it, actually. I love that he's just as Batman. He talks like a normal person talks, and not like the Nolan films. But he's also just quietly furious and quite broken for most of it. Part of it, the journey goes on is perhaps to become a more useful vigilante than he was at the start of the film. And I think it's interesting that in the first sequence, it shows someone performing an armed robbery, and it's actually a fantastically shot sequence. I love it. And the camera keeps focusing, zooming in on the shadows, and implying that Batman might be in any shadow, and goons are scared of the bat signal going up. But he doesn't stop the armed robbery. He just beats up a load of random thugs somewhere else. And it's almost like he has this unfocused rage that does become clearer, and his purpose becomes clearer throughout the film. I think that's kind of the arc he's supposed to go on. So I found that satisfying. I'm just sort of not sure about Batman as a hero. Like, what I liked about Pattinson's performance of Bruce Wayne is that he's really ghoulish. He kind of, he looks like kind of husk with his flat hair, and he almost hunches while he's playing Bruce Wayne. As a man who's been, a recluse for years and doesn't want to be seen. I thought it was a very pleasing change of tone to the kind of billionaire playboy, which I think these days just isn't a heroic idea.
Yeah.
Given people's, opinions of various billionaires. So I enjoyed what it did with the Batman, and I felt very satisfied, and I enjoyed a lot of the action, but maybe half of the action, I would say. And as an action film, it's got to have punchy bits. I was satisfied by it, I think. How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I agree about Pattinson. I think he's great throughout. Like, the version of Batman I like. I mean, I like the Frank Miller run, or at least some of it, of Batman comics, because I like Batman when he is a creepy, messed up weirdo, essentially. And that's what this film is going for. And I think Pattinson's great casting for that, because he can both lean into, the moody, emo teenager stuff, which obviously he's got form with. And I think it's interesting that this is a Batman he's only a couple of years into his career as Batman. He's still depicted as very adolescent, his floppy ear and his eye makeup hunched over his journal, essentially. And I agree with you that that opening sequence where they introduce the Batman as a concept and show the criminals being afraid of him is possibly the highlight of the entire film.
Yeah.
And it's narrated, which is a really interesting choice, but that narration lets the film get to something that it gets to Batman's inner monologue, which obviously you get through captions in the comics a lot of the time, but you don't tend to really get in the film so much. And I like the fact that it's not just his inner monologue. It's what he's writing in his journal. So when he describes himself as a nocturnal animal in the monologue, he's actually writing that and underlining it 3 times in his journal, feeling ways about stuff and getting all moody. And
it's very Rorschach. I think it's intentionally meant to kind of echo Rorschach from Watchmen.
Well, I feel Rorschach is meant to echo Batman in a lot of ways. Like Alan Moore was commenting on how what would Batman be like if he was actually existed, and that's Rorschach. And to an extent, is it Al? boy, who's the other guy, is another reflection of Batman, as well in those stories. But it's I don't fully buy the character arc they try to give Batman over the course of the movie, and like I do think the film is ultimately hopeful. Like it's trying to depict potential in Gotham's future by the election of a new mayor, by the change in Batman. But the change in Batman isn't that he grows as a person or makes like a moral change in any sense. It's more he makes like a branding change, because the combination you're right that he doesn't stop the armed robbery at the beginning of the film, but the culmination of that is that he beats up those guys in the train station, and the person he's just rescued is as afraid of him as the people he's just beaten up. So the people he's helping are still afraid of him, because the guy on the ground that he's just saved says, please don't hurt me, and then then we cut away, and that's the kind of end of that segment, versus obviously the end of the film where he is heroically leading people from the wreckage, and we'll get into the plot stuff there, but it doesn't feel like he's made any kind of like moral transition as the character over the course of the film. He's just decided, PR is really important, and I need to give people hope, and so I need to stop referring to myself as vengeance every time I meet someone. Essentially.
I kind of disagree. I agree that I think the arc he goes on is perhaps is superficially presented, but I worry that a sequel isn't going to be able to continue that arc in a way which makes sense for him. I mean, he's not going to spend a sequel pulling people out of rubble and working in soup kitchens. So I don't know where it can really go. But I think in terms of a moral change, I think he gestures towards one. I think we'll come to it. We'll come to it, I guess. I suppose the thing that I will say up front is that there is a part where he discusses, he must become more, and that's obviously I don't know if that's an echo of a line from the comics. It's obviously an echo of a line from the Nolan films, where Ra's al Ghul is telling him that he needs to become larger in the minds of his opponents, that he needs to become scarier, essentially. But Robert Pattinson realizes in this film that he just has what being more means is being more than a tool for vengeance, but one of healing too. And it's I feel like it's such a direct repudiation of some of the messaging from the Nolan films and obviously of the Frank Miller comics that it maybe felt weightier to me in this film than was perhaps even substantiated by the actual content of the film. But I do think there are a few moments where it does ring true. Whether it it sort of leaves it hanging about whether that will come to any kind of fruition. So I guess we'll see. But I do really love that opening. It's such a fantastic atmospheric thing. It's interesting that weirdly the things he's describing don't really match what happens in it, because he says he can't be everywhere, so he has to choose his targets carefully. But then in actuality he just turns out to be at the station where the criminals randomly alight, and then he's like but I am the shadows, and they all fear me. But then he comes out of the shadows and they're like, who the fuck is this guy? They had no idea. Anyway, but it's still super powerful. But actually that isn't the beginning of the film, guys.
No.
It's not the opening of the film. I really like that the opening of the film is actually setting up the villain, and with quite a conscientious horror / serial killer vibe, I think. Again, I think the introduction of the Riddler is fantastic. Not only so there's a couple of cool things in that opening sequence. I really like. It's kind of a needless detail, but you see the Riddler observing his prey through binoculars, and he's watching through a window as this sort of ninja cartwheels around, and then it's revealed that the ninja is actually very, very small. It's a child, but you only realize that because of the contrast of scale when his dad comes in. And I don't know why. I mean, there's quite a lot of little kind of needlessly clever little devices in the film like that, which I think lend a sort of level of interest that It doesn't necessarily need, but I felt kept my attention for the massive amount of time that the film takes.
I think that scene is really important because it's the film, like, otherwise might invite you to think that the Riddler is right. And that this mayor is just purely corrupt, and that's all he is, and that's all that kind of his whole existence. That, that he has to be deleted because of what he is. Whereas him playing with his kid, like, he comes in and his kid's dressed up as a kind of samurai with a little sword, and he falls down, plays dead. The kid comes back in, and they hug, and you're like, oh, that's kind of sweet. So when the following scene happens. He's not just a kind of a mayor with some corruption issues. He's actually also a dad. He's also more of a person than you might otherwise think. And a lot of the problem I have with, like, some vigilante stuff is that it kind of invites you to actually say, "Oh yeah, no, he was right to kill him. He was corrupt, and actually, yeah, I would follow him on Twitch." Or whatever the film might want to say. So I think that was actually a really important moment.
It's also the beginning of drawing comparisons, or it's setting up the ability to draw comparisons between the Riddler and Batman.
Yeah.
Because we see, as Marsh has just said, the Riddler observing the scene via binoculars, and then that's mirrored later when Batman tracks down Selina Kyle, and we get a long scene of him across the street viewing her through binoculars, and it's one of several ways in which the film is saying, hey, maybe the heroic vigilante is also somewhat problematic.
And it's right. I mean, when Riddler and Batman eventually had their confrontation, and Riddler's like, but we're one and the same, we're not so different, you and I. In other words, I mean, he's dead right. And the fact that Batman flips out at that just shows just how emotionally untethered he actually is.
I like the sort of, like, Riddler's project management. He sort of sees Batman as a sort of ally in his quest, which is actually kind of an interesting angle on the villain.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that. There is actually Selina Kyle does say, "We're not so different, you and I," which I think should there should be some sort of, it should not happen in scripts.
I agree with that. But the comparison between the two, like, I like the way that they allude to it throughout the film. Like, there's another thing where I've just mentioned that Batman is writing in his journal at the beginning, and then later on when they discover Riddler's apartment, he's also been writing these moody screeds in all these notebooks and that sort of stuff. But these are things that we see and the Riddler does not see. So, like, I don't wholly buy the idea that the Riddler thinks Batman is on his side. Like, what has Batman done other than one act towards the end of the film that the Riddler could possibly interpret as meaning that the Batman is on his side? Like, it doesn't wholly make sense. Like, Batman is known throughout the city. It's established in that opening montage as someone who beats up criminals and is working with the police. Like, he just walks around in crime scenes and enters the police precinct, and, like, that's a known thing that he works with the police. So, like, why does the Riddler think? And there are all these sorts of things where I love the film as a vibe, but I'm not convinced by it on the level of plot. Like, I think it's got loads of plot problems in its structure, and as we get into, like, the construction of the mystery and whether that's satisfying, I think there are loads of problems there.
But let's stay with that vibe for the moment. I think just talking about the look and the feel of the film, I really love the texture of it. I mean, it's almost completely without color apart from umber and occasionally red. And everything else is just this greenish grey. I've seen it take flack for looking flat or washed out or murky. I didn't feel it felt flat at all. I really liked its murkiness. One of the things that I noticed watching it a second time is that the characters are there's so many shots where the characters are barely lit in the foreground and the background is lighter than them. Not quite silhouette, because they are perhaps lit by bounced light or rim lights, and then there's smoke and fog or rain filling the background. But it's everything is I don't know, I found it very evocative. It feels a lot like David Fincher's Seven, and I think very intentionally. There's a lot of Zodiac vibes to it as well. Obviously, in the case of the Riddler, but even in the way it's shot, it feels very similar. The city has a similar kind of baroque, ancient grandeur, which is just absolutely sodden and soaked and rotten through. It's noticeable in that the scene in which they introduce Batman beating up the people at the station. It's raining inside the station. Everything is so wet. I think it looks fantastic, and the sound design is incredible as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great Foley work. There's an amazing noise when Batman pulls a thing out of a tire, which you should listen for if you ever watch it again. And people are often like softly spoken, and there's a sense of the size of the room in which they're talking quietly. It reminds me of the sonic space of Blade Runner, strangely enough. And there are also visual kind of references to Blade Runner elsewhere. Not only in the rain, I guess, but in Falcone's lair, at one point it's sort of sideways lit from outside by this incredible sallow light, and it's definitely very Blade Runner. But what did you guys think of the way it looks?
Yeah, I think it looks amazing. It's maybe my favorite Gotham depicted. Like I do really like the mega gargoyles and theatricality and staginess of Burton's Batman films, but this being a kind of mega New York, I think one of the earlier shots is of, it looks like Times Square, but with 6 times as many billboards and utterly rammed with traffic and people, and it's super claustrophobic, the entire thing. And I agree with what you were saying about the Foley work and audio generally. Like, Tom, I think you mentioned that the introduction to Riddler is serial killery. I mean, I think the introduction to Batman as well. Like, it's not just that the way he beats everyone up in the train station, it's the way he emerges from the shadows and you hear the clumping of his boots first. You hear him very slowly walk into scenes, and they repeat that again and again.
Yeah.
Like he is almost like this Freddy Krueger-like character who walks places rather than runs, and yet keeps up with everyone. It looks stunning. I love how wet it is, and obviously water plays a bigger part later in the story as well. It's good damp, moist film.
I love how the soundtrack, the soundscape expands and contracts a lot. So there are moments of silence where people are just allowed to be alone in a room, and it's just their voices. And then it goes outside, and as you say, it's like this soaking, sodden place. And I just thought, like, a sound that I call like a hushed roar of just rain collapsing onto buildings is such a beautiful sound that just it gives you that sense of space and being outside. And it's just full of little moments like that, little kind of touches and changes in intensity, and with this like really insistent soundtrack, the main theme, which is drawn from Something in the Way by Nirvana. Is similar, like the note relationships are the same. It's just a kind of really pompous, massive version of it, and that is like super effective. And I felt my heart rate just increasing watching it when it chooses to crescendo. It's like, oh my god, something's really happening. It's like the Batmobile chase, and in some of the fight scenes, I've really sort of, on a sort of second or third watch, I still got that. Super effective. I think aesthetically it's a great film.
It's got amazing set design as well. Like I love Bruce Wayne's house, where he seems to live in like a gothic clock tower
like
or something.
Gormenghast.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and stuff like the funeral for the mayor that they go to, which seems to take place at City Hall. Like, that's the building that they pull up outside, but when they go inside, it's this big gothic cathedral-like building. I'm not sure what's going on there, but it looks incredible.
I love that. Well, I think it's sometimes like spatially it doesn't make any sense. So, for example, the Iceberg Lounge is like 5 entirely different places. So I think as Bruce Wayne goes to visit Falcone to learn, about his father and his relationship with Falcone. And he goes into the Iceberg Lounge to get there. But when he goes into Falcone's office, it's like it's a completely different universe. It's like, that's not inside a club. It does that a lot. But I think that's the sort of thing that while you're watching it in the cinema, you don't really clock necessarily, at least not consciously. Whereas on rewatch, it's like, what? It's kind of more puzzling.
There are a few parts of the film where I don't think that connective tissue really works. But in those scenes, I absolutely bought it. But now you mention it, it doesn't make any sense.
So the office, Falcone's office, is like 100 feet off the ground, and there's a giant window showing a street underneath. It's like, isn't this supposed to be deep inside a nightclub? It's the sort of thing you kind of clock on a second or third watch. It's not really something that caused any issues for me, like watching the film initially. But there are some sort of weird logic problems with the film, definitely.
Should we move on to Batman entering the scene of the crime? Because I wanted to. I mean, are you convinced by Batman as a detective as you are as a gothy, borderline suicidal nutcase?
Look, he solves those riddles so fast. He must be the best detective in the world.
Yeah, he's very good at little wordplay puzzles.
He's great at Wordle.
He'd be good at Wordle. I think on the evidence of this film, he's a mega shit detective. It's awful, and he accomplishes almost nothing. And Selina is a much better detective than he is throughout. But I do like that version of Batman. Like, that's the other part of Batman I like. Like, I want him to be a creepy psychosexual weirdo, but then I also want him to be like a hard-boiled detective. Like, that's the kind of I like Mickey Spillane and Mike Hammer detective novels and that sort of stuff, which is from a similar era as the original Batman comics. And I want him to be the world's greatest detective, and there's something really exciting about the fact that this is operating for the most part on the scale of something like Seven or Zodiac. Like, it is a series of murders that Batman is investigating, and there's a human frailty to Batman throughout that's not present in any of the other recent Batman films, or maybe any Batman film ever. Definitely. For that matter. And the tools that, with a couple of exceptions, the tools that he's using to investigate are mundane. He's got his magic eyeball contact lens recording device thing. And the rest of the time, he's just talking to people and reading things and going to crime scenes. And I mean, just that itself, like, it's really exciting that at the beginning, Batman walking through a crowd of police officers to a crime scene, that immediately was like, oh, I haven't seen this before. Like, when was the last time that this took place in a film version of Batman, that he was just going to a crime scene and other people were just, they didn't like it, but they kind of got used to it, or like it was a thing that had happened before.
But there's a real vibe of that when Batman is entering the scene for the first time and he walks down this corridor which is lined with cops. It's very reminiscent of like the goth kid walking down to the new school he's just arrived at. I think that's got to be intentional. It's really interesting. I think they manage this weird position for Batman, where he is obviously incredibly powerful physical presence and could turn any of those cops into blancmange with a single blow. But then there is also a sort of kind of social nervousness to him, which is sort of strangely contradictory. But it does work. He seems both kind of imposing, but also desperately insecure, which is exactly, I think, the vibe they were going.
I think it's because he never directly addresses anyone he don't really trust. So he'll address Gordon, but when other people around him talk about why the hell is this freak here, he just literally stands stationary as a statue. Like, he will not look at them or talk to them, and that's the energy, isn't it? That's the social kind of awkwardness, but also he is supposed to be this kind of gothy loner as well, so it plays into that. I do enjoy the sort of like bromance between him and Gordon. Just the total trust Gordon has in him for some reason. I know that, like, he's been Batman for 2 years, so they've obviously built a relationship. And also, I'm so glad the film doesn't, spend loads of time on building up why that is. Like, we don't need to know. But
Mm.
is the fact that Gordon is just like, I trust you implicitly, and I completely rely on you to do the right thing, no matter what, is kind of bonkers if you think about it.
Yeah, just staying with that for a second, how readable do you think this film would be for somebody who hasn't encountered Batman before? Obviously, the filmmakers are assuming that audience is a very small one, but it is interesting that they've chosen to just skip over any kind of origin story, and sort of not even really explain Batman's existence at all. I'm glad for it. But
I mean,
Me too.
yeah, I'm very glad of it, but I do feel like that opening montage does a lot of work to set up, like not the Riddler bit, the bit after that.
Yeah.
But it's it introduces Gotham, it introduces the problems of the city riddled with crime. It introduces Batman conceptually. It introduces him as a person. You get an immediate vibe that he's messed up. So, I think that does enough to establish a universe that you sort of can roll with it, probably, even if you've somehow managed to avoid all Batman stuff forever. Don't know. Do you guys disagree with that?
No, I think that's right. But I find it hard to judge what somebody who doesn't know what I know about Batman would know from this film. But I do think it does enough. I mean, I'm glad that we've sort of reached a level of sort of literacy with at least comic book properties now that they don't have to constantly apologize for themselves as they arrive, which I felt has been the case and is still the case with video games when they broach like mainstream audiences. But it's such a relief to watch this film and just skip all that stuff. I think it's really nice.
I wonder if this sort of the father-son mirroring of the mayor and his son, and the fact that the son was kind of found the body and that kind of stuff. I wonder how that would land for new people. But then he does go into it later, and he discusses it explicitly with Alfred. And by the way, Alfred does most of his detecting for him as well in this film.
Oh, yeah.
Which is sort of does his homework for him, which is quite a weird energy. But yes, I think characters like Catwoman are more confusing than any other characters. Like a character's been introduced in this bar, and then he spies on her in a really creepy way, and then she just changes into a catsuit and somersaults off a building. Like, if you don't know anything about the Batman universe or what the significance of having lots of cats is, that must have been quite weird. Or just baffling.
How do you guys feel about the presentation of the police in general in these films? Because I think a lot of certainly the recent Spider-Man games, for example, and other comic book properties show this kind of cozy relationship with cops, which is sometimes disquieting.
I mean, it's kind of the tradition in Batman stories that the police are almost entirely corrupt. Like, it's never valorizing of police, really. Like, Commissioner Gordon is usually the one straight cop, and even he is often seen like turning a blind eye to the corruption all around him. Like, that's true of Gary Oldman's Gordon in Batman Begins. Like, he knows his partner in the beginning of that film is taking bribes, but he's no rat, so he won't say anything about it. So that holds true across a lot of Batman. And I'm okay with that, I guess. Like, I would rather that than the thing you sometimes get with Spider-Man, or Superman for that matter, where sometimes they're like honorary members of the local police force.
Yeah, I think I agree. The cynicism, I think there's a degree of cynicism towards the police that is that avoids it from being too cloying. But at the same time, the police are kind of like weather in this film. They're just around, and they clump together, and sometimes they run into a room and run out of a room. And it's like, don't you guys have other things to be doing? Like, why are 40 people in this small room with Batman? There's a lot of kind of odd moments. The police are just sort of like there when they need to be. Sometimes it rains police. Sometimes they're just not useful to the plot, so they're just not there. So I didn't find it problematic or anything like that. I don't think I don't have any problems with the way it's presented. I think they're just sort of roommeet a lot of the time, which is kind of it happens. Like, I'd rather that they didn't spend any time on it in a very long film.
I do love the escape from the police precinct where everyone starts chasing after him, and all the police officers, just hundreds of them, start going rubber, 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 rubber,
Yeah,
rubber,
yeah,
rubber,
yeah.
rubber. They're all just yelling constantly. Like,
Yeah.
why? Everyone else can see Batman as well. You don't need to constantly yell, "There he is!" And also, there's a point where like Batman is going to the roof to escape. He fires his grappling hook or whatever, and he's getting chased on by a bunch of cops on the ground floor. And he shoots his grappling hook up. And as he zooms up 6 floors, the camera pans up with him, and another door on the 6th floor bursts open, and there's 30 cops there. Like, how did they know that Batman on the ground floor was escaping and that he just punched Gordon in the face? Like, how or did they run up the stairs as fast as Batman could go up with this? Like you say, they are like weather, or they're being spawned in. There is an enemy spawner, and just round the corner out of sight, and they're just being spewed out.
There's a sort of plot-driven hive mind behind their activity that
Yeah.
makes them just. Also, a lot of the secondary characters, all the secondary men in the film, are kind of the same character.
Mhm.
They all talk. They have the same demeanor. They talk in the same way. They have the same views. There's a lot of sort of template people in the background in this film. Maybe that's intentional to not distract from the Batman. But it's kind of weirdly noticeable once you actually think that.
Yeah, it's Gordon's former partner Pete who is like, what you doing getting the Batman in here? Get him out of here. And then he gets eaten to death by rats. And then so they just introduce another bearded cop to be like, what are you doing, Gordon? Why is the Batman here at the crime scene? Like, it's just what? Like, they just...
Why did they all have moustaches? I've never seen so many moustaches in a film. Just arbitrary point.
Although that guy does the second piece does have that weird voice, because he is that that guy from Chernobyl.
He's awesome. Also, Chernobyl is awesome.
Very strange voice. You're gonna put your neck on the line for him, Gordon.
I feel like the mustaches are part of the aesthetic. They're part of the 70s sort of Zodiac killer vibe.
It's clearly intentional, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's got one.
What do you guys make of the whole clues, the Riddler's clues, starting with the thumb drive? I feel like this part of the film, which is so essential, it was also probably the weakest. Like, I was never really invested in any of the riddles as puzzles, because they're either instantly solved by Batman or they become meaningless over time. I hated the overproduced greeting cards, which would have been impossible to anybody who isn't a motion graphics expert, a graphic design expert. And then the video, which he produces, which again would be a challenge to a studio producing that video. But in general, I didn't feel like the mysteries really held together. Like, I didn't see a purpose to it as they unfolded.
This is the problem I have with the film's plot, is that it is a mystery with a wholly uninteresting mystery. And like the best mystery stories, you get clues, you have red herrings, and each new piece of information you get is surprising. It recontextualizes previous bits of information, and that just doesn't happen here at all. Like, the clues they get and the revelations are just, we discovered A, then we discovered B, then we discovered C, then we discovered D, and a lot of it is of no consequence. Like, B doesn't even a lot of the time lead to C. They just kind of stumble across things. And like, even the thumb drive thing, for example, like they get a cipher and it spells out the word drive, and so they go and check the guy who got murdered's garage, and it's like, didn't the police search the house in the first place after he was brutally killed inside the building? They didn't think to, like, I don't know, check the other rooms of the house to find them, a blood-soaked pair of secateurs or whatever it is stuck inside I don't know. Like, none of that wasn't satisfying or exciting. And then so many of the revelations and the discoveries are just carried out by other people. And I don't mind so much when it's Alfred doing Batman's homework. But in some instances, like the revelation about the orphanage, for example, and Thomas Wayne's relevance to the entire plot of the film and the personal significance for Batman is delivered by one of Riddler's Adobe After Effects lore explainers. Like it's not discovered as a consequence of
Yeah.
Batman going to the orphanage and exploring these clues.
Yeah.
It's literally it is broadcast on television by the villain, and there's so much of it like that. Like when, and I don't know if I'm skipping ahead here. I'm talking about this before we get to it, but like the ultimate revelation about Falcone at the end is discovered by Catwoman, for example. Like throughout this film, it feels to me like Catwoman is maybe the actual protagonist, who is off camera being much more proactive. And when Batman arrives at places, Catwoman's already there, and she's the one that solves a bunch of the problems in the actual film. And I don't mind a plot in which Batman is not all-powering, he's not the hero, he doesn't have to solve everything. But if you're going to spend this long on a mystery, it's got to be an interesting mystery with twists and revelations, and a plot that seems to follow from one scene to another.
I think my main problem with it, I mean, we are skipping ahead here, but why not? Is that there is a twist, which is that it's revealed by the Riddler that Thomas Wayne ordered a reporter to be killed. And then literally in the next scene, that is dispelled, Or maybe not the next scene, because Batman goes to confront Falcone. Bruce Wayne, rather, goes to confront Falcone. He confirms this. Then he talks to Alfred, and it's instantly dispelled. And it's just like, well, that twist didn't really need to happen. The film is 3 hours long, so let's just cut that part out. And then ultimately, all of this is building towards the revelation that Falcone, a reputed mob boss, is a mob boss. I'm like,
so much of it is
yes.
that. Yeah.
I mean, why is it a surprise that the corrupt police are working for the mob boss?
Yeah,
that's literally the most obvious thing.
The trouble is, I think we'll get onto the Penguin chase sequence, which is I actually really enjoyed the sequence, but I found it hilarious. But all the revelations are just like, a man you've never heard of is corrupt, and as an audience viewer, that means nothing. Thomas Wayne is Bruce Wayne's father, so that might mean something. But the rest of it is just like a new arbitrary name did a thing 20 years ago. I was like, what?
I don't know. I think if from the point at which Bruce Wayne discovers that his father was corrupt, and that jeopardizes his entire understanding of the legacy of the Waynes and his pursuit of justice. If that had lasted for an act rather than literally 15 minutes or whatever, I think that would have been a successful twist. But because it is just instantly discarded, it becomes meaningless. And I think it's discarded in order to give that moment with Alfred some greater impact, because during that scene, Bruce Wayne realizes, but I don't want to go through it again, because it's not justice that's most important, it's preserving the people you love, sort of thing. But I think just it feels a little unearned, because Alfred is just feels like this sort of expository mushy weak link in a very long film. I don't really care about his fresh berries or his time in the circus.
that line with the fresh berries is such a weird.
Why would you keep that in?
I like Andy Serkis as Alfred. I just don't think it felt right in the film.
It's the most hackneyed, trite sort of emotional beat, and I feel like that. A lot of the scenes with Alfred are like that. Like even the first scene with Alfred, where he comes down to the basement or whatever to see his moody adopted teenager. Batman, like Alfred is worried about him and expresses some concern, and Batman says, "Just stop it, Alfred. You're not my father." And it's like it's like the teenager saying, "You're not my real dad." And I don't fully, because it's so cliche, I don't buy into the emotional reality of those scenes. But to come to the Falcone revelation, I felt like it was ambiguous. Like there's a mirrored line where I think Falcone says that Maroni was the one that killed Thomas Wayne.
Yeah.
And Batman repeats the information back to him, and Falcone says something like that. Say something like, "Do I know it for sure? No. but it makes sense to me. And then basically Alfred says the same thing. Alfred implies that Falcone was the one that murdered him, and Alfred says, well, do I know it? Am I 100% sure? No, of course I've racked my brain. And so it feels like it's designed to be ambiguous, but his ambiguity has no bearing on Batman's actions after that point, as far as I can tell. And and so because seems to have no personal significance and really no plot significance, it feels like its only relevance is like Thomas Wayne's reputation is the only stakes in that whole section. And it's like, well, I don't care about Thomas Wayne's reputation. Thomas Wayne's purpose is to be dead as motivation for Batman. I don't care whether he was corrupt or not, unless that, as you say, Marsh, affects Batman's actions in some way. And it doesn't really align for me with Batman's growth of character. Like Alfred almost being killed does. I understand that that's part of his motivation to be less of a dick, but
yeah, I feel like the ambiguity over who killed Thomas Wayne, I think they preserve that very intentionally, because it's a kind of a hallmark of Batman that he at times projects the identity of whichever villain he's currently fighting onto the unknown killer of his father. But I don't know that it serves the plot in this film.
Yeah, it's the Uncle Ben thing.
Do that.
My take is that they preserve the ambiguity of it because they want to do a bunch of tie-in TV series telling the prequel story, and that's why you've got John Turturro playing Falcone.
Yeah.
That's why you've got Peter Sarsgaard playing the district attorney. That's and they've already announced a Penguin series, which is set within this universe with Colin Farrell playing the role in the TV series. And so I think it feels like that's a thing that there's going to be a prestige 8-episode crime drama about, which will reveal the truth of the Thomas Wayne mystery. Ooh.
Should we talk about Penguin's club scene?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think the introduction to Penguin is great. I think this is one of my favorite scenes in the film. After there's a sort of that, I like the way that Batman enters the club and the way that's echoed throughout the film. I think that's very funny. But then after he gets in, that sort of long shot of that ratcheting, desperate chaos that he pursues, which seems to have no real logical outcome for Batman than death. That's the way it's going. He will die in that scene up until the point where Penguin intervenes, and I think it's superb, because you not only get a sense of Batman as just a terrific fighter, but also he is one who is plowing mindlessly into suicidal odds, and he can take a hit, and he certainly takes a large number of them, but it still underscores that he is very vulnerable, mentally and physically. I think it's quite an achievement to have a fight scene in which he mashes a dozen guys, and for him to still feel like he could be murdered at any point.
It makes me like Penguin as well. The fact that he just walks up to Batman in the middle of the fight and is like, "You looking for me, sweetheart?" It's immediately oh, cool. He's ballsy and he's kind of cheeky in the way he introduces himself to Batman, even as Batman is beating up all his goons. So immediately I'm like, cool, I want to see these guys interact in the next scene. And I think, I love Penguin throughout the film. Colin Farrell's performance is incredible. And obviously the makeup, I didn't realize it was Colin Farrell. I had no idea he was in this film. And I found out 2 hours after I got home, when I was looking up the film on the internet, and was like, what? That was Colin Farrell? I had no idea whatsoever. So the makeup is obviously incredible. But even the makeup aside, I think Farrell's performance is really good. He creates, in quite a few scenes, a really interesting character with a lot of seeming depth.
Fat, evil Robert De Niro.
Well, yes, that's one way to boil it down.
No, you know how in a comedy duo there's a straight man and the person who does all the jokes, the Penguin is, for me in this film, the person who sort of calls everything out a little bit, calls out how silly things are. And so after the chase sequence, when they pin him against a wall, he just calls them out as being just ridiculous cops. Obviously, and that is, I think, really, really, I love that note of humor. And he's like that throughout, and but it's also is I've still found this scene between Batman and him tense because I didn't know if Batman was just gonna mess him up at any given moment. Like if he was, if the Penguin annoyed the Batman would actually sort of really hurt him a lot, and I didn't want that to happen. And that's a weird emotional reaction to have to like a villain.
But I think that's why the depiction of Batman is so good. Like they create these scenarios where you're worried about Batman being the the one that's going to beat someone up. Essentially, like he's the one with the seeming physical power in most of the situation he's in.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love the where he sarcastically refers to Batman and Gordon as the world's greatest detectives. Like he sarcastically throws Batman's tagline back at him.
Yeah. So
I do think that this film, probably not aided by Nolan's run at Batman and comic books in general, have an obsession with scarred faces, which is now getting out of control. Like Two-Face is the character with the scarred face, but this film adds scars to both Penguin and the Joker, and like those are characters that are not canonically scarred. I do think that they need to just stop relying on like physical deformity to insinuate evil. It's just a little too much.
If anyone wants to listen to our like Bond podcast, that's the thing that we touched on there with a lot of like traditional Bond villains are actually defined by their disfigurements and things like that, and it's the kind of thing that is just not necessary.
Do you want to talk about Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman? How do you guys feel about Catwoman in this film?
I mean, I think she's great, and like I said before, I think she's sort of the protagonist of the movie. Like she's not a damsel, I don't think, at all. Like there are a couple of moments where she's saved by Batman, but she likewise saves Batman. She has her own personal stakes in the story, which she pursues often off camera. The resolution of that story is, very much her own. She discovers her dead friend. She goes and finds her killer. She's the one that uncovers Falcone's involvement with the DA, and seemingly is the person who shares that with, if not the public, then at least the police and Batman, who then share it with the public. And I like the romance, essentially. Like, for all that Batman is a creepy weirdo in this, like the other part of it is this matinee idol romance where he's posing with Catwoman in front of the sunset on top of buildings and stuff like that. And I do like the relationship they form over the course of the film. And also Tom, you touched on the fact that they don't really set up Catwoman as a concept, but she is surrounded by lots of cats, and she does, drink milk in the middle of the scenes. My favorite little nod. I don't know if a nod is the right word. Is where they're getting on their bikes at the very end of the film, and like Catwoman is leaving town, and she's got a motorbike, and she's loading a cat into like the trunk of her motorbike.
I saw that on the second turn, the second viewing. I was like, but she chose only one. She had like 3 or 4 cats.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, I think she's superb. I think Kravitz is really good. I think, like, as a physical performance, I think it's really interesting as well. Like, incredibly kind of staccato movements that feel very purposeful. I really like that. But I also think, she's a good foil for Batman. I think she is. I think in her relationship with Batman, you do see Batman's moral growth because she challenges his sort of monomaniacal focus on the case. Because he's obsessed with, his own investigation, and he just doesn't have any compassion for the actual victims that are being embroiled by this. And I think her disgust at that actually is the thing that makes him change his mind. And I think that's cool. I also like the fact that she's really cool and Bats is a total dork, and he doesn't even know about the secret club in the club, and she sort of rolls her eyes. What a lamer.
I do like that scene in the club where Catwoman goes in and meets the district attorney. There's a lot of I think it's a good acting performance from Zoe Kravitz, that she's sort of switching between disdainful mockery of Batman in her earpiece to performative flattery with the district attorney to emotionally pursuing, information about her dead friend. And there's tension there where she's, confronted by Penguin first of all, and then Falcone. Like, there's a lot going on over the course of 3 minutes in that one scene, and she performs it well. And it's tense as well. Just that she's going into the belly of the beast. Whoa. Batman is ineffectually badgering her in her ear like the big lame-o that she is, as you say. Sorry, Tom, go on.
Oh, I was going to say that actually I think that her performance is fantastic, but the character itself is still a bit too close to just being sort of an emotional prop for Batman's growth. And there are kind of allusions to the fact that she's doing stuff in the background. But I felt like, when she kisses him, I felt like that came out of nowhere and made no sense. I just felt like it was just kind of glorifying Batman in a way that wasn't earned, even though they'd laid a lot of the groundwork. But even in that sunset scene, he basically implies that she might have slept with people to get close to them.
Mm-hmm.
And she.
Oh, really? I didn't get the sexual connotations of that. I thought he was just saying that essentially she got her friend killed in pursuit of the big score.
I thought it was like, what price did you pay to get close to these people? And it's sort of too, for me, that was like a bit too open. It's like she shuts him down, which is great, but at the same time, I think there was just kind of a very strange energy in that scene, and for her to sort of then kiss him at the end was really weird to me. I thought it didn't land at all for me. And I think as great as the performance was, I think Catwoman was too much of a prop in this film. Even though she is portrayed as being awesome and a good fighter, she doesn't. I don't think she ever wins a fight in the film, apart from a guy that she beats up in a car park before the Batmobile chase sequence. She does stuff in the background, and she's obviously incredibly good at what she does. But also this, the plot point with the woman who just vanished and ended up dead. It was kind of like I think this film is kind of really bad for female characters. I don't think it did a good job at all of presenting strong female characters. Even the alternative mayor, of course, is a good character, but I think the film has a problem with that, I would say.
I feel like it strays close to that to me, but I disagree, I guess, overall about Catwoman. Like, I think she does win fights throughout, and like that scene in the car park, Batman and Gordon turn up to investigate, and Catwoman arrives of her own accord, having found it via her own investigation.
That's true.
Then she beats up 2 guys, and then she discovers the body of her dead friend. So like she's pursuing her own investigation for her own reasons, completely separate from Batman. So like I don't necessarily need her to win every fight or to, tell Batman to get stuffed, because he is a big lame-o. I think partly the romance with Batman works for me because I think from the off, although he is dismissive of her in many ways and quite scornful of her in many ways, he also does, I think, in part show concern for her. And he is Robert Pattinson, the hottest man in the world. And I think that buys you a certain amount of forgiveness on some of that stuff. But just the fact that she's pursuing her own story, she has her own stakes. And yes, those stakes are the death of another woman, which is unfortunate. But there are a lot of people who get killed in this film, and that Catwoman pursues that doggedly of her own accord, mostly without Batman's help, and then mostly solves it. Like she once after she's found the body, she does then go get the cop partly responsible, beat him up, tie him up, and catch him. We don't see that, but she's obviously won fights and done a bunch of stuff without Batman to get to that point. And like I said before, she does get the information about Falcone that sort of leads to his arrest. And, it does the thing that Batman completely fails to do. The investigation that he and Gordon have just spent like the last hour and a half of the film on, is actually cracked open by Catwoman. And then when she goes and confronts Falcone, she gets the drop on him. she is only sort of screwed over by stupid Batman turning off the electricity and making everything go dark. And then in the ensuing fight, she does beat up those guys. And I think she gets Batman's help at one point when Falcone gets the better of her. But up until that point, she beats up a bunch of goons.
Yeah, I think. I think that's a really good point.
And then she rescues him at the end as well when the incels, the incel snipers, Batman is hanging from the rafters or whatever. It's Catwoman that goes up and, beats up the last guy or whatever and rescues Batman. And then he saves her in turn, but she saves him first.
Yeah, maybe I think I'm perhaps like reacting more a bit too emotionally to the fact that he sort of uses her eyes and then sends her into a club to get hit on by men. That felt super weird to me.
But I mean, I think that's sort of highlighted because there's that moment where I think she expresses some sort of vulnerability, and he says, "Look at me," and then he takes her face in his hand, and it's like he's going to reassure her, but instead he's just checking that her contact lenses work. And that is purposeful because Batman's arc is that he lacks that compassion at this point because he's so in pursuit of his own agenda, his own vengeful agenda, that he doesn't see the harm being done to the little people, in inverted commas. But I think that's what changes across the course of the film, at least nominally. I don't know if it really sells it, but I think that's the point of it. I think it's intentional that he's callous at that point. And,
absolutely.
And you're not meant to think that's good.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's part of Batman being depicted as the creepy weirdo throughout. And I would agree that I think in most of these films, they wouldn't have had any of the personal stakes for Catwoman involving her mother, involving her friend, or any of that stuff. And they would have just had her be the prop for his emotional development from treating her very poorly to treating her slightly less poorly at the end of the film. But because she seems to have her own heroic journey and narrative arcs separate from that we see at certain points, and it intersects and some of it, like I say, happens off camera. Because of that, it feels to me like Batman is the creepy weirdo, not the film or the filmmakers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I could see like a lot of parallels between this film and Seven for sure, but also this film and Taxi Driver. And Taxi Driver is also framed by a written account of the internal monologue of Travis Bickle, who becomes a vigilante and is eventually like celebrated for being one, but it's actually just a journey of like a person being poisoned by his own obsessions with corruption and the cesspit of the city he lives in. And that is kind of like interesting. To what extent are you supposed to go along with the character monologue, and to what extent are you supposed to reject it? And especially, I think Taxi Driver works because Travis Bickle is not an established superhero. Batman is like a massively established superhero, and while his morality has been questioned in lots of different ways through like Miller's comics and things like that, I'm still worried that the hero archetype invites people to think that he's cool when actually a lot of the things he's doing super not good.
Yeah, I do think the film struggles with that. I do think the film struggles with depicting Batman as the heroic protagonist of a comic book movie at the same time as trying to develop a kind of character arc and depict the things that are troubling about that mindset. It does. Obviously it ties in with the incels and it ties in with Riddler and all this sort of stuff throughout. But with Batman as a character, I think that's one of the flaws of the film.
Yeah, it's difficult because I don't see any way the film could get around that really, because they can't help that everyone knows that Batman is a hero. So how do you do a complex kind of character assessment of Batman as a troubled person, a troubled, individual in that context? And like, I think the film. I don't think the film's terrible bad on this point. It's an interesting sort of point of the character, really.
I think it's part for me of them not selling that emotional arc strongly enough. Like they depict him visually and aesthetically like a crazed serial killer stomping into scenes, but then they still have, and it's designed as a joke, and it's quite a funny line where he and Gordon arrive at the orphanage, and Gordon gets his gun out, and Batman says, "No guns." And Gordon says, "Hey man, that's your thing." And it's like, well, that's quite a funny line. So fair enough. But like Batman as a vigilante who doesn't like guns doesn't really track for me with everything else about him, where he cares not about victims, where he refers to himself as vengeance, where he's completely committed to just beating the pulp out of everyone. The fact that has this moral line where, no, but I won't use guns. But that's sort of a heroic stance that the film sort of suggests that he's not heroic at the point at which he says that. And so like there are these like internal inconsistencies with the character about, you know, the tropes of what you know about Batman, and also how the film is trying to depict him and what change it's trying to depict in him. And I would have almost preferred it had gone further in making him explicitly unheroic during, you know, the first 15 hours of the fucking film before the point at which, you know, he turns and develops. Like I might have bought it more if it felt more consistent.
Yeah, I think it's not the film's fault really, because I think it's mired in the context of superhero films in general, in that, you know, there's so many of them have been released by Marvel in the last sort of few years. The idea is ultimately that Tony Stark can get drunk and make a fool of himself, but he's ultimately doing great, guys. Like superhero archetype, it's hard to not map that onto other superheroes, and it's not the film's fault at all. It's just like the context of the things, perhaps, you know, I think you can't escape from.
Would you like to tick off a couple of other cast members?
Yeah,
Sure.
What do you make of John Turturro as Carmine Falcone? I think personally miscast.
I've really enjoyed like John Turturro's, like the Coen brothers have had him in their films loads and loads. I did find him suitably a little bit sinister. I wonder why do you think he's miscast?
I don't think his character exists at the kind of register that would be required to be the arch villain of this film. Is my main problem with him.
Is that because actually his performance isn't like terribly, you know, exaggerated? Like he's actually just very quietly talks to people. That's his whole, all of his interactions. Is it because of that sort of presentation, or is it because you think that, or perhaps the fact that he's just wearing shades doors all the time for reasons I don't understand?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a culmination of different things, but I also just don't think like physically he has enough of. He doesn't carry himself with enough of a sense of threat, and I guess that is intentionally downplayed. But if you compare that to something like Vincent D'Onofrio's performance as Kingpin, which is also you know, a very quiet performance a lot of the time, but is resonant with menace.
Yeah,
I feel like John Turturro is just, you know, your uncle. He's just your uncle.
but I think that's the kind of that's the sort of crime cesspit vibe that they're going for, isn't it? Is that a normal guy walking past down the street could be a crime boss? Maybe that's what they go for.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been in
I'm
a
not
film
convinced
in
why.
which you've got literal, you know, super villains. It
Yeah.
feels a little bit. He doesn't quite manage to carry it. Graham, you didn't feel the same?
I guess I hadn't thought about it that much, to be honest. I agree. I mean, he's a bit nothingy. And I don't know if that's because he's miscast or if it's just because there's not enough screen time to really develop him. I mean, I think D'Onofrio is fantastic as Kingpin. Like, he's the best thing about any of those Marvel TV series for Netflix by far.
Yeah.
He's got such an internal rage, and he's such a physically imposing character that just standing there's always that threat of that rage coming out. And there was obviously Falcone is being depicted as a very different character type, where maybe it's that, you know, he's got brains and he's a bit squirmy and he's your uncle, but he's hired all these goons and he's got this weird looking penguin fella working for him and all this sort of stuff. But they don't really depict that. So it's not clear if that's actually what they're going for or if that's just me wondering if that's what they were going for. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, it's John Turturro.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, like, why is Carmine Falcone the head of this operation, which otherwise has a complete maniac in the form of the Penguin as part of it? Like, the Penguin would obviously be at the top of that operation. it feels like the power levels go down the further you go up the family, which doesn't make sense to me. But don't know. How about Jeffrey Wright? I love Jeffrey Wright.
I love Jeffrey Wright as well. He's just great in everything, and I don't think he has a lot to do in this. I mean, he's in a lot of the film, a lot of scenes, but I don't think he has a lot of range as a character. But I love Jeffrey Wright. He's always great, and he brings a lot of gravitas to it.
Yeah. He sort of mostly exists to read out the Riddler's cards,
Yeah,
which is fine. But he also has some sort of. I just feel like his character never really connects with Batman. Like that, they have this pre-existing relationship that comes into the film, but he literally just you don't get it until he literally says, "I trust you completely." That's kind of how the drama kind of presents their relationship. But he's great. Like his he has the same sort of husky, whispered delivery of people uncovering meticulous plots, and that's kind of what Gordon has to do in this film, and that's all he has to do. That's all he is in this film.
We talked a bit at the beginning about the presentation of the Riddler, but I mean, how do you feel like Paul Dano, his vocal performance, etc., in the role?
Yeah, so it's a lot of his voice is kind of warped by the kind of vocoder, or perhaps a deepening aspect that kind of changes it and makes it more sinister. A lot of it is kind of just yelling odd words and sentences really loudly, and that. But I still I did find it a bit disturbing. I'll be honest. I think he did hit on something, and also you got to get away from the Jim Carrey Riddler. Based on the tone, like you can't do that in the tone of the film. So I feel as though his sort of sellotaped face with his glasses and him just sort of like existing in the background in that opening sequence at the very start of the film as just a silhouette that kind of watches this guy around the room. I did find him to be very creepy, and I did enjoy his performance, I thought.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think he's great. I would go further. I think he's brilliant throughout. He's creepy with the deep voice. He's creepy with his high, squeaky voice. He's creepy
Right.
with his glasses. He's creepy with his mask. Yeah, it's a very physical performance. Just the way he unrolls masking tape is creepy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, you think he's pulling something else out during that scene quite intentionally.
Yeah.
But then, I think the fact there's some scenes where, like you say, his thing is yelling the odd, strange words in a sentence. But I think the fact that he is doing a performance as the Riddler sort of excuses that. It's a little too much. It's a little too kind of intentional, I think. But then that sort of makes sense because he is performing for the cameras, and he's not necessarily gauged that right. But I think it's very impressive they've taken this incredibly kitsch and camp villain and then rooted him so definitively in real world anxieties, and yet retained quite a lot of his hallmarks. I think it's a real twist. I was not at all sold on it when I saw the kind of the leaked character art, but then when you see him in the film and he's sort of this wheezing presence in the background, and then when he attacks people, it's just this barely controlled, incredibly ungracious lunge. It's a terrifying performance. And then I really like his confrontation with Batman, where he when Batman essentially rejects him and he loses his mind. I think that's great.
So disappointed.
Yeah. That's like such a great scene. They set it up so well with the suggestion that Riddler has worked out that Batman is Bruce Wayne,
right?
And so it's like great stakes and great tension going into that scene, and also Riddler is a big part of the first hour of the film, and then barely a part of the next hour at all. And so when he meets Batman like 2 hours 20 minutes in or something like that, it feels like there's been quite a lot of build up leading to this point. And he's a great foil for Batman. Like, they're complete opposite performances. Pattinson is just standing there. He's, immovable in most scenes. He barely expresses himself. He's just deadpan face, standing motionless. And Dano is squirming and arching his head and hunched and drooling and screaming and giving it all. Like I love the contrast between them. But I don't like the last video they found of him, which he opens with, "Hey guys, thanks for all the comments, especially all the tips on detonators." It's just that it's a little bit too far. And to remember to ring that bell, like and subscribe.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because it's kind of like veering literacy when it comes to technology in these films.
Yeah.
But like, obviously, it's they've picked up on the idea that people on the sort of maniac fringes of society use these sort of forms of social media to communicate, but then they have no idea really what that means. Like a cop says, he's got 500 followers. Brilliant. And then there's the website which makes the entire screen go black, or Gordon putting an arch villain's thumb drive into his own laptop. Just stuff as dumb as hell. Like, I mean, it feels like the filmmakers at times have never used a browser to look at the internet before. And it's just I don't know if that's just like a weird convention in Hollywood, in the same way that people don't seem to be alarmed by the fact that nobody ever says goodbye when they hang up the phone. Is it just one of those things, like that computers are these magic devices which can sort of do anything, even though they are so mundane and familiar to the audience that it would immediately feel weird?
There's no excuse for it. there just isn't. I know that, like, obviously they have to build fake Googles for every search engine search that people need to do, but you'd think with the budget for a film like this that would not be a terrible problem. And you should, like, it's not hard to understand internet culture in 2022. it's just it's right there in front of you, and so if you think you check the script for things that made sense, like 500 followers is nothing on Twitch, like, you know what I mean?
I do think there's another deflatory moment in that confrontation between Riddler and Batman. It's similar to how Falcone gives Batman the revelatory information, and then it's immediately undercut by the next scene. It's that they do set up the stakes of, well, maybe Riddler has worked out that Batman is Bruce Wayne. How is Batman going to wriggle out of this one? No, it's okay. He doesn't think he's Bruce Wayne. Oh, okay. I thought that the twist is you thought it was interesting, but it wasn't. Like, oh, okay. It still really works as a dramatic scene because the performances are so good, and the music is great. Him punching impotently against the glass is great, but the scene has no real consequence whatsoever, other than it just being like another point of Batman going, "Oh wait, maybe I should stop referring to myself as vengeance and be nice sometimes. When the woman touches me, don't push her away."
I really like this film when it's just people talking to each other quietly. But then I'm not so keen on its escalation towards like mega budget action. I don't think, for example, that the Batcar chase with the Penguin really works for me at all. And then the kind of the final escalation towards the flooding of the city, I was just not particularly invested in that. But Tom, you mentioned earlier that you quite liked the Batcar chase.
I did enjoy the Batcar chase, and a lot of it is because the soundtrack is extremely, extremely loud and good in the cinema.
The car sounds great,
and the car sounds incredible. And I love the idea that he just sort of like jammed a jet engine onto the back of like an old American muscle car, and that it's not some sort of hyper slick thing. It's just he's improvised it, and it's the idea of being it's bomb proof, it's bulletproof. Anything that happens to it, it just keeps on going, and that's Batman's personality, right? That's Batman's character expressed in a car form, which sounds dumb, but it's actually kind of the point of it. And it's the fact that there's a very, very, very convenient ramp at one point where it does get to sail out of an explosion. But I really like that they sort of built the Penguin's emotions into the chase, in the sense that he was desperate panic, thinks he's won. He's like, and he yells, "I got you! I've got you! I got you! I got you!" And then the sort of death Cadillac emerges from the flames and lands and rams him. It flips in the same way that would definitely have killed him. But he's fine. But then he's upside down, and the upside down shot of the Batman was one of the the big points of the trailers, and it's just a really good shot. And then he sort of like leans in slowly. The ridiculous thing about it, apart from I think it takes place on a bunch of unidentifiable freeways that seem to interlink in ways that don't make any sense. But fundamentally, the point of a car chase is that the person you're chasing might go somewhere where you can't find them. Whereas every character in the film knows exactly where the Penguin is going to be every day, because he runs the biggest crime club in the city, and it's well known in the underworld. It's like Batman could have just parked the car, gone home, come back the next day, gone into the club. Penguin will be there, so it's this idea that he's chasing him almost out of spite and just to terrify him, which is, but I think that's a generous interpretation, because I think the real reason is that the film had been slow up to that point, and they needed a big chase sequence, and they wanted a Batmobile. I love the Batmobile. I love the way that the tension builds throughout the chase, and how both of the cars like have encounter jeopardy. It's absolutely ludicrous that they're running against traffic. But the thing is, like, the point of the sequence is not that you should logically break it down and think about why it shouldn't happen. It's supposed to just excite you for a bit and then sort of calm down so that the next bit of plot can happen, right? But yeah, I think Marsh might have a different take on this one.
No, I kind of, you've kind of talked me around. I did like it after all. No, I think emotionally it does fulfill its intentions. I think it's just, there's just such a, I don't think you can take the way that the film has been shot hitherto and use that to shoot action in a way which is then that legible, because a lot of the just the way that people's faces are framed and the kind of even the depth of field just work against a kind of coherence that's required to describe multiple cars, where they are, what they're doing at the same time. And so I found it a little incoherent. There's some weird stuff. Like I simply do not understand why Batman revs the engine, then turns the car off, and then Penguin escapes, and then he drives after him. That's just I don't really get that. I mean, I'm okay with the convenient ramp. That's fine, and presumably the hundreds of people who died in that pile-up. But yeah, I did. I felt the whole thing was just slightly too difficult to follow, such that my attention wandered to the point where I was questioning why structurally this car chase had to happen. I don't know. I didn't find it that successful. But then I think maybe the problem is that, and this is definitely true of the sort of the escalation when it gets to, you know, the vans parked around the city which explode and flood it. Like, they do so much work sort of grounding Batman that when the action sort of reaches towards those kind of comic book histrionics, there's a sort of a disjunct which is greater than if it had existed in a sillier register the whole time. And also the arena is clearly largely below street level, so it's a terrible place to go in a flood. But but I do like the idea of the kind of the Riddler corralling people into a trap. That's quite clever. But then the whole battle there is a little kind of, they haven't worked out how that would physically work, or at least they don't communicate how Batman's jumping around those girders physically works. It feels like it's a little kind of making excuses in the cuts for action which doesn't really exist.
I think this ties into the really weird moment where so skipping back to the escape from the police station when he gets to the top, and how odd that flight sequence is, and how I thought it was kind of, it's chaotic, and it was Batman not know, like, his equipment is not fully formed, like he doesn't have the mega cape that sort of flexes out to become wings, and he's just desperately suits up, and he gets really injured, except only for that scene. But there's a great speed to it, but wasn't it just like, it did jar for you? It sort of like felt really odd to me, like in terms of the way it was shot and the way that it was kind of tight.
Well, I don't know. That's the scene leading up to that. I don't know. I don't know how this film has come together, but I suspect that perhaps some parts were originally meant to be attached to other scenes and then get reattached here. I don't really buy the whole sequence of events where Batman gets blown up, then is somehow in a police station,
Right.
not being unmasked, then is the threat of being unmasked, and then there's the laziest excuse for him to escape, which is he punches out Gordon and then just walks out of the room into a stairwell. None of that makes any sense at all. But then I do like the sort of the punctuation of that, which is that he's correctly terrified of heights, and then his wingsuit escapade ends in just the most ungracious parachute accident. I think that's a really. I worry that they will eventually make Batman too competent. I like him in this vulnerable stage.
I do agree. See, I agree with everything you both said, even the bits that contradict the other bits, which is also how I feel about the film. Like, I like the moment of vulnerability as he's jumping off the top of the building. Not just that his flight suit's not a great piece of technology and then he badly hurts himself. It's the moment where he jumps up on the ledge, looks over the side and goes, oh. Like he's actually afraid for a brief moment, and that's humanizing in a way that I like. But it runs counter to a lot of the other stuff I like, including the car chase, where it's the thing I like about that is that it's, again, a horror movie, essentially, where Batman is the villain. He's this unstoppable thing. And even when everything is exploding, you know, he cannot be stopped. And I really like the way that whole scene is shot. I agree, like, someone suggested to me that the point at the beginning where his engine goes off was that he stalled the car, which if there had been like a reaction shot of Batman inside the vehicle, then that would have sold that as a jokey moment of like, oh no, he's, you know, it was this big dramatic lead in and then it's been just completely undercut with a bit of bathos, and that would have been cool. But that's not the tone of that chase at all. There is almost no shot of Batman during that car chase. Like, he gets inside the car and then he just is the car. and it's almost like, you know, to me it feels like Duel or something like that, where it's just the, you know, the creeping truck where you can't see the driver and the sinister nature of that. Like, it almost has that sort of vibe to it of you know, Penguin is the victim running away from this absolute psychopath coming after him unstoppably. And I really like the way it's shot all in close-up. Almost there's almost no wide shots establishing the spatial relationship of the vehicles to each other, for better and worse, essentially. Like, every shot it's the camera is really close to the wheel. The camera is like looking in the wing mirror. And even when Batman rams Penguin, you know, you see the car coming in the wing mirror, and then the car spinning through the air, you see from inside Penguin's car, with Penguin getting like thrown around before it cuts to, again, it's not even a wide shot. It cuts back to the side of Batman's car, and you see Penguin's car kind of like spinning away into the distance. And so, like, I like how claustrophobic the whole thing feels. It's terrifying, and it's really energetic. That view of Batman is like, as the horror antagonist, is completely opposite of him being afraid at the top of the precinct, you know, trying to escape. I like both of these things, but I don't know that they necessarily cohere in the same movie.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't really track in the sense that I like the idea that Batman might be scared, and one of my favorite sort of performances of a hero who is scared is in Children of Men, where the protagonist is actually, when shooting is happening around him, like, he just looks really scared for his life, as anyone might be. Whereas in this, like, the whole point of Batman is that he's supposed to become a bigger thing than himself, an icon. And that car chase sequence, I think, was perhaps the crescendo of that. And that's one of my biggest kind of points of irritation, perhaps, with the film, is that it crescendos really early, and then the final hour, the third hour, felt like a different film, where, with different stakes, like, they just sort of reset the plot, started it up all over again, and it was just exhausting. Honestly, like, that was my main sort of reaction to it. And again, like, since I've watched it since, I have the same thing. I watched the first 2 hours and then I'll go off to the shops because the last hour is just its own sort of self-contained thing that doesn't feel terribly. It doesn't terribly flow from the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The plot is over at the point where Riddler is captured. That's it. Like, they've caught Riddler, and Falcone is dead, and Catwoman has avenged her mother and her dead friend, and that's it. Like, there is no hanging plot thread at that point, and they really do need to start it up again with the revelation that Riddler also hates his floorboards and has like carved writing into it, just like you saw Batman do earlier. These people, why do they not just use paper? And it spills up again. Although that said, I do like the kind of visual of the city flooding. Like, that feels, given how wet the rest of the film has been, that feels like a good nadir for Batman's journey, because it also marks the point where Batman has just utterly failed. Like, Falcone got killed. he did Riddler's bidding unwittingly. He completely failed to unravel any part of the mystery on his own successfully. And you can't punch water back into the sea. And so there is something that's such a low that's kind of compelling within the world of the film. But then I don't feel like they know what to do with that. And so it does just turn into the incel snipers. And there's a weird repetition to it as well. Batman gets knocked off and he's hanging from the rafters, and then he gets back up, and then he gets knocked off the rafters again, and he's hanging there.
A lot of gantries in this film. A lot of gantry fights,
And even that, there's an emotional payoff in that, where Batman beats that man to a pulp and they pull off his mask and Gordon says, "Who the hell are you?" And the guy responds, "I am vengeance." And it's like, well, yeah, but we already had the scene with Riddler. So we've, at this point, if Batman doesn't get it, then did we really need the incels? I don't mind it as a plot point, this idea that Riddler is a social media star building an army of internet malcontents and broadening it out thematically as a problem with the city as a whole. But the film doesn't need it in terms of the character arcs of anyone, and it's one extra thing, and it's just like, man, guys, save some of this for the sequel or something.
I think actually kind of Batman's journey is over when he stops. His moral journey is finished when he stops Selina from killing Falcone. Because at that point he realizes his argument for stopping that isn't just some I don't use guns or some abstract thing about justice. It's that you don't have to pay with him. You've paid enough, which I feel like is Batman suddenly experiencing compassion, in a real way, and understanding what it is to be a victim. And that feels like that's the arc. That that's the rebuke to the libertarian macho man of Frank Miller. And then it doesn't really need the whole "I'm going to save Bella Real" in this.
I guess maybe they thought they had to have a bit where Batman comes in through a glass ceiling. And to be fair, the precise bit when he does, pretty cool. It's pretty good.
It's pretty cool that he's obviously lined explosions. He saw that there was a flood, and then he saw that there were lots of vulnerable people inside. And he spent some time laying out his explosives so that the maximum number of victims would have glass fall on top of them.
Yeah, he did. He constructed a 12 explosion firework display so he could safely land, even though he is bulletproof and bomb-proof, as the rest of the film has demonstrated. Which is fine. He's a superhero. That's how it goes.
What do you make of what they did with the Joker in the little cameo?
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I didn't need that. I really hope the sequel's not about the Joker. And we don't need the Joker again. He's not necessarily the most interesting Batman villain. Not every film needs to either be about the Joker or be setting up the Joker.
He's also very similar to the Riddler. If you're trying to set a course for Batman again, really the stuff that Joker does, setting bombs and tricking people into going to different places, which is basically both of the MO for both of them. it's kind of inviting a kind of someone who wants to win an Oscar for being the Joker. There's just so many Batman villains that might be more interesting.
But how many of them are magical, I think, is the problem. Because I don't think, at least at the kind of tenor that this film operates, that magic would make any sense in this world currently. And yet, some of Batman's enemies are actual crocodile men. Or undead, in fact. So, yeah, I don't know which other one they would pick upon, which would feel similarly grounded. I think you really have a choice of Riddler, Joker, and Two-Face.
Scarecrow, maybe.
Scarecrow.
Scarecrow's good.
I mean, fuck it, just get Cillian Murphy to play him again. He's still creepy as heck.
He was great. Yeah, he was good at that. I don't know, Calendar Man.
He's always the one I think of as well. I mean, I would not be averse to the sequel just being about Penguin and Riddler again. I don't need it to be a rotating rogues gallery.
Yeah.
You've introduced a bunch of interesting characters and some compelling character dynamics. I kind of want to see what's next for these guys.
I'm absolutely definitely going to watch the next film, because this one was like, as long as it was, and I know we sort of like poked at it a lot, but it was really, really entertaining. I found, and I found since on rewatches. So same vibe, different mystery, same Batman. I'm into that. Like, I will watch it, definitely.
Yeah. I think I still feel a kind of level of concern that they might double down on this city is beyond saving level of corruption, which I think just gives a free hand to sort of libertarian selfishness. I worry that they'll turn like Bella Real into a corrupt figure, because I've seen this loop in so many things where they get like somebody who is a young and idealistic person from the left, and then go, aha, but wouldn't it be really interesting if they were actually evil? And I find that deeply tedious and unhelpful. I worry that could easily happen. I also worry that, like you say, they could just end up trying to do an escalation by throwing loads of villains at it. But I see lots of peril for a potential sequel. But I did like this one sufficiently that if they could continue in the direction they're going. I don't know that I particularly care that for a more backstory. I don't necessarily want there to be a combined universe for this across lots of different media. I feel like that hasn't worked out well for DC so far. But if there is to be a combined universe, I would prefer it to be Matt Reeves' universe than Mr. Snyder's. I would say.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I agree with all that, but they have announced the Penguin series for HBO or whatever, and I will watch it.
Yeah.
So,
Colin
got
Farrell
me.
is good. He is dead good in this. Having a lot of fun.
But I really hope the sequel, whatever it ends up being, is small stakes. It doesn't feel like the end of this film necessitates an escalation. And so, let the waters recede and make it another detective story, but a better detective story, please. That will almost certainly not happen, but it's my hope.
Yeah, so like the Daredevil was a good series for a couple of seasons, I think, and then it was the escalation into sort of like international ghost ninjas that was actually the problem with it. It was like the characters at the heart of it were fantastic and really well casted, and I share the worry that it might go like, don't go to Raz Al Ghul and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think I mean, this seems to be a problem, particularly for DC heroes, that they work really well when they're in their own backyard, but as soon as they step into the sort of the global scheme, there's all kinds of power mismatches. I mean, this universe described here is not a universe in which Superman exists, and it could not be, and it would be much worse if it was.
You don't want to see Robert Pattinson standing on a space station with Superman and Wonder Woman.
I think it's quite telling that there's a moment where the thumb drive moment, which is actually probably the worst part of the film, perhaps. It is, oh my god, it's emailing all of my contacts with the vital information, but none of them are like Metropolis. Like, they're all like Gotham.
Oh, really?
As far as I could tell. So it feels as though they've been quite careful with kind of not bringing that into it. So fingers crossed.
Any other bat thoughts?
What would you do with Batman if given a free hand, Marsh? This is a question I'm reading from a sheet that you wrote, so I'm hoping you have an interesting answer.
I really don't. I mean, I suppose I would say that I'd keep Batman completely self-enclosed. I mean, I don't particularly. I feel like the expression of Batman as a sort of colorful camp character has already been done, and I think the best versions of that already exist, and I don't feel a real need to revisit it. I think talking about using Batman to talk about vigilantism and the sort of libertarian ideals that Frank Miller espouses, and using Batman to deconstruct those would be good. But I don't know that. I wouldn't say I'm bored of the character because I really enjoyed this film. But there's unlike other properties, I don't immediately see a way of kind of revitalizing them that I'm super excited about. How about you guys?
So I agree that Frank Miller is problematic, especially nowadays. I don't think he was always as bad as he is now, though. And I do think there are interesting ideas in Dark Knight Returns, which is the most famous Batman comic he did. And, I would still like to see an old Batman story. So the Batman movie I would cast Michael Keaton as Batman and play a Batman the age that he is now. Because the setup for Dark Knight Returns is that Batman is retired, and the reason he's retired is because he was kind of successful. Like, he caught the Joker and all the other villains, and they've been in Arkham Asylum, and the city has been okay for like 20 years. And so, like, it starts off from a place of, well, there was hope. Not everything is not doomed. There is then obviously a turn towards the worst that drags Batman back. But I think it's an interesting story. An old, kind of broken Batman who doesn't have the powers of combat that he once did, trying to step back into that role. And there's interesting stuff with Robin in that comic as well.
Yeah.
And Robin's almost never good in any story. So yeah, I think maybe not a straight adaptation of Dark Knight Returns, because a lot of it is very 80s. But there are ideas from it that I would like to see pilfered and used in a film.
Yeah, Michael Keaton sort of reprising a role would be amazing, especially because he did it in a sort of quite meta way in Birdman, which is a film I really enjoy. It's a very different film about a bunch of actors in a very claustrophobic theatre trying to put on a show, and a guy whose fame has passed, but he's haunted by his former success in the form of a giant looming creature that just talks to him all the time. It's very good. So that energy would, if that was put into an adaptation of Batman Returns, could be kind of interesting. It could be really good. I think I would like to see if this film had been a 6-part series with a good detective mystery, it would be the best telly. I think it would have been fantastic. So I think I would like to see a kind of series, just completely fantasist thoughts, but a series with the same cast that does the Court of Owls arc with Batman. Have you guys heard of the Court of Owls?
Yeah.
No.
And the Court of Owls basically, I'm not spoil it necessarily, but it's a sort of long, dark tea time of the soul for Batman, where he gets dragged into a dungeon by a cult, and he has to go through all of these rooms full of puzzles, very Riddler-like, very Joker-like, but they're also just kind of expressions of how Gotham used to be. And he has to fight through them, and he gets increasingly, weary and poisoned and doesn't have any food, etc. And it's a kind of really grueling mission that Batman doesn't tend to go on. He tends to just go and punch the guy who's the problem. Whereas this is more like a sort of psychological torture, which sounds awful, but would make a great 6-part HBO series.
All right. I'd watch that.
Yeah, on that sinister note.
On that sinister, that's all the Batman we have time for. You can find us on Twitter at Crate and Crowbar. You can watch this audio recording on YouTube, the address for which is youtube.com/Crate and Crowbar. You can back us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar. Backers don't get charged for these lock-in episodes. They only get charged for the game pod. Or you can join our lovely Discord community, the link for which is on our website, crateandcrowbar.com. That's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Tom Senior.
And I've been Graham Smith.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening,
everybody.
everybody.